Good evening and welcome to this discussion session where we are going to discuss the book Saving the World from Hitler, India's Battles in World War II, which is authored by R. Prasannan. This evening we are joined by a very distinguished panel of speakers, General V.P. Malik, former Chief of the Army Staff, Dr. Robert Lyman, Fellow, Royal Historical Society and Authority on the World War II, Squadron leader Rana, Secretary and Editor, USI Center for Military History and Conflict Research, Sri R. Prasannan, Senior Coordinator, Editor, The Week, and the author of the book, Sri Subhas Borkar, Editor, Citizens First TV, who is going to moderate the session. It is indeed my pleasure to introduce the moderator of the session, Sri Subhas Borkar. Mr. Borkar is media person, broadcaster, documentary filmmaker, and activist. He heads CFTV, that is Citizens First Television, New Delhi, with over 39 years of independent documentary filmmaking experience. Mr. Borkar is the convener Jan Prasad, founder Green Circle of Delhi since 1992, convener Working Group on Alternative Strategies since 1992, and Managing Trustee D.S. Borkar Memorial Foundation. I request Mr. Suhas Borkar to take the discussions forward. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Munshi. Welcome to the panelists. Since Dr. Munshi has already introduced everybody, so I think I'll, without further ado, move on because we have very limited time. So I would request Prasannan, who is a veteran journalist and is presently the senior coordinating editor of The Week and is the author of the book, now to kindly introduce the book. Prasannan.
Thank you, Mr. Suhas Borkar, and good evening, fellow panelists. First of all, thank you all for joining us in this evening to distinguish my little work, Saving the World from Hitler, India's Battles in the World War II. I'm really honored that such a distinguished panel of speakers have come forward to, and the moment I requested them, all of them agreed. I mean, they said the only thing is that they wanted to see the book, and the moment they read the book, within a day, I got the positive response from all three of you. So thank you very much. Mr. Borkar, as you asked, yes, I shall introduce the book. This is actually the idea started last year was the 75th anniversary of the Second World War, the end of the Second World War. So that time we had we at the Week magazine, I worked there as a senior coordinating editor. We thought of bringing out a special edition to commemorate the event. That we do, unlike several other news magazines, we go for this sort of special articles once in a while. Like we had one on the First World War. In fact, Squadron China was part of that project also. Then we had one on the 1971 war, the 40th anniversary of the 71 war we had. 50th anniversary of the 1965 Indo-Pakistan war we had. On the 10th anniversary of the Kargil war also we had a special issue. And not only wars, in fact, we had one on the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. Mr. Dr. Lyman may like to know that. In fact, one of the best packages of articles were in the Week magazine. So like that, we often do that, unlike several other news magazines. So this was a project like that. It was entrusted to me by the editorial board of the Week. So I went ahead and started my research. Well, I had read, quite a lot on the World War and all that. So when a magazine looks at a cover story, what do? We always look for what's new angle, what is there, because we are at the end of it, we are a news magazine. What is new? What can we say to the reader new that he doesn't know? Because the World War is known to everybody. Every kid knows about Winston Churchill, Stalin, Roosevelt, Hitler, Mussolini. These are household names which every kid who has read something and gone to school knows about it. So what do we do? What more can we say about even the conduct of the war is known to most people, the campaigns and all that, those who are interested, I would say. Now, then we thought of, okay, what was India's role in this war? Very few people knew about it. When we asked around also, yes, people think, yes, we were there. We were part of the British Empire. So they asked us, they recruited a lot of our millions of our boys and they took them to war and they were paid. I mean, they all joined for the pay perhaps. And that's it. That was the idea. I mean, when we talk and the great battles, they don't know. They know about certain battles. Yeah, Battle of El Alamein, the fall of Singapore. People know about it, but the role India played in this, people were not aware of it when we asked. So we thought we'll focus on that. Okay. As we researched, as we went deeper and deeper into every battle, every campaign and all that, we realized, my goodness, India was a very, very crucial element. Indian army, Indian divisions were very, very crucial to several of the battles in North Africa, in East Africa, in Burma, and even we thought, okay, when we look, was there any other, I mean, theater of war where we were not present? Perhaps the Pacific. No, when we looked at even the Pacific, we were there in Philippines. Sorry, in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong garrison, the brunt of the Japanese invasion was borne by the Indian regiments there, in the battalions there. Burma, of course, everybody knows that. Russian front, of course, we didn't fight on the Russian front, but getting the supplies to Russia, I mean, getting the oil for the Russian front from Persia, the Anglo-Persian invasion, sorry, the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Persia was actually conducted by the Indian Army. It was Indian Army's operation. So when we looked at that, we thought this is something we had to highlight for the reader. Now, when we did that, we collected all the material and all that, but then the military accounts have been written, because where did I get the information? I didn't go to any primary sources. I read books written by experts like Dr. Lyman and several other authors who took part in the war, or also secondary sources. I mean, there are several accounts of the war. No, we went further. Then we realized, no, there is a lot more to it that has to be told. We had to make it anecdotal also. We had to relate this to the common man. So that was the idea of this book. Actually relate these events to the common man, because we have all in our school, high school, we have read Indian history, we have read about the national movement, the independence movement, and several of figures also those personalities figure in this account also. Well, Lord Irwin, I mean, we call him Lord Irwin, but in UK they call him Lord Halifax. I mean, he was the Viceroy of India. This was the guy who signed that pact with Gandhi, and they had it was almost a mutual admiration society. We didn't, I mean, you read it and then only you come to know. Gandhi called him the most Christian and gentlemanly Viceroy of all. And similarly, it was Irwin who called Gandhi Mahatma. The first Viceroy to call Gandhi Mahatma was Irwin. So there were a lot of mutual admiration, respect, and all that. And these stories have to be told. But to make it lighter, to make it simpler, to make it relate to the average common reader, we brought in a lot of these little anecdotes that Irwin didn't have a left hand. In fact, you would be very interested to know that the great movie Gandhi by Richard Attenborough, he makes a mistake in that. He shows John Gielgud was acting as Lord Irwin. He acts with both hands, but Irwin didn't have a left hand. So I wanted to bring in this little anecdotes. Or Cripps. Every school child who has gone to high school has seen the picture of Stafford Cripps having that, sharing a joke with Gandhi and laughing. So that's a very famous picture in most of our textbooks also. But why was Cripps sent here? He was a vegetarian. He could, I just put it, he could sup with the Indian devils. So that is it. So these are all Wavell. Everybody knows Wavell, the penultimate viceroy. But he comes in through our history books as a kind of cardboard character. No, he was a man who wrote poetry in the battlefield. He had only one eye. So these are the little things I wanted to bring into the book and make it more human. In fact, that's that. In fact, the tagline of the week magazine itself is journalism with a human touch. I wanted to bring that human touch into every story. Also, there is something else. I think my fellow panelists may be able to say more on that or throw more light on that. It's also a story of bonding, a sort of political bonding. Look, we may say we were the Indians were in the national movement that we were fighting the British or opposing the British at the same time. Yes, and but remember the national leaders also, even while launching the non-cooperation movement and all that, or even Quit India movement, did not attempt to stop the recruitment process. Recruitment was going on. They just looked the other way. It was a sort of way of cooperating, and they didn't stop the flow of resources from India. India contributed a lot to the war effort, not only in terms of human material, but even material support, industrial resources, everything. Lots of it went from India. In fact, there is a chapter on that. So the national leaders also who were fighting the British at one level didn't attempt to stop that recruitment or the flow of resources. So there is a sort of, that's what I said, there is a sort of invisible bonding also. And there are several other levels at which this bondings you will see. One, of course, is at the political level. Then there is also, General Malik would be able to say more on that. There is also that military bonding. There is always the bonding between the officer and the troops. They know that how sacred that bonding is. So all that bonding also I wanted to, I mean, I don't know how far I have been successful in talking about that in the book, because it's a very small book, just 120 pages, and every second page or third page is a picture. So the text is very little, but that is I think the charm of, I wanted to bring in that charm. I don't know how far I've been successful. I think let the readers read it and find out. But I'm sure the panelists would have to say more about it. So I'll wait for them. Then I leave the floor to them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prasanna, for that. You see, the point which you have made very well is that, this is a forgotten chapter of Indian history. So you're bringing it back. Now, that's very important because we contributed, 2.5 million men. That's a huge force. And then 87,000 dead of our men and 64,000 wounded. And then it was, we can't forget that it was the largest voluntary army ever raised anywhere in the world history. Yes. Now, I would request General V.P. Malik to come on. He's been a distinguished chief of the army staff of the Indian Army. And let's hear General Malik, please.
So you're mute.
Thank you, Mr. Walker, and good evening to my fellow panelists as well as those who are watching and listening to this webinar. Firstly, I must compliment the week and Mr. Prasannan for coming out with this book, Saving the World from Hitler, India's Battles in World War II. He has described very ably what he has written and the human touch in the whole book. There are few other facets also of the book that I would like to mention. But this book comes 76 years after the World War got over, Second World War got over, but when we are commemorating the 75th year of our independence. So something which had been forgotten, which many of us will still feel that it has been forgotten. I think it's an apt addition and an apt part of our commemoration of the 75th year of our independence. And I also must mention here that this was one of the factors. Our contribution in Second World War also contributed to the British making up their mind to give independence to India as early as 1947, 2 years after the World War got over. Now, there are many reasons why I appreciate the book. I must compliment Mr. Prasannan and his co-authors for this. Firstly, of course, This book is not so much about the politics and military activities of the overall Second World War and the hows, the whys, and who all participated of the total Second World War. We don't get lost into that whole picture, but we focus on the India's role in that. This is what I think our younger generation needs to know more, because they have to appreciate what we all did uh, for keeping the world independent, so to say, and for peacekeeping of the world. So I think by focusing on the Indian role that we played in the Second World War, I think it makes it easier for our population, the Indian population, particularly the youth, to grasp the role that we had during this war. Secondly, yes, I must say it is not verbose. It's a very tightly knit narration, just about, I think, 200 or 125 pages, including those sketches, etc. And there are very nice sketches in that. I would say it is like a primer for the youngsters. And that would hopefully make every student of our schools and colleges read it and appreciate. So it's an ideal book for the younger generation. And what we want our younger generation to be aware, to be proud of the India, of our country's contribution, our soldiers' contribution, their valor, and the sacrifices they made for the world peace. So that is the second aspect that I thought I will mention. Incidentally, it's also a very inexpensive book. I don't think it's about 200 rupees or something, which is really peanut these days when we're talking about. And of course, coming from the authors like Mr. Prasannan, whom we have known for a long time, and he has been writing for the week for a very long time, almost 2 decades. And Squadron Rana, of course, is an authority as far as we are concerned. And I'm so glad that he continues to be looking after the department of our military history in the United States, United Services Institution. Not to forget his son, Adil China, who's also contributed in this. So I think it's written in a very simple, easy to grasp language, which is, again, I would say, ideal for our young and old generation in India. Now, I have a little objection to the title of the book. I don't think we can only say that India saving it from Hitler alone. We should also mention the Imperial Japanese, because it is not only the Hitler, but also Imperial Japan. So that observation I thought I must make. India saved not the world not only from Hitler, but also the Imperial Japan. And let's not forget what the Imperial Japanese did to the country that they occupied earlier, whether it was China or South Korea. I mean, those stories, even now people don't forget in these countries, China and Korea. So also, the fact is that the Imperial Japanese, they managed to come to the eastern gates of India, to Kohima, to Imphal. And they did want to occupy India. And as somebody has written, India was the most sparkling jewel that the Japanese were coveting. So in a way, India was quite central to the entire effort that was made during Second World War to beat the Axis forces at that time. And now I come to the question which has always bothered me, and I'm sure it must be bothering many other people also, about the Indian participation in World War II. And also, I think it is relevant to World War I. And those questions that come to my mind are, why do some people say that it was a white man's war and not that of India? That idea continues to be there in many minds in India, as well as, I would also say, to many people in Britain. Why do the British themselves tend to undermine India's effort? And so many politicians and academics in India, they look at this contribution as a British effort rather than that of India. 2 years ago, when Britain celebrated the Normandy landing, at that time there were guests from all over the world, but Indians did not get the right seat there to be able to mention about the contribution that we made. Similarly, I think most of us, we have seen that picture of the Dunkirk. There is no mention of the Indian soldiers. And we know that the Indian soldiers were there, those animal transport people who had been inducted in France before all of them had to be evacuated from there. So I think there is a reason why do we forget the sacrifice of so many Indian lives, or the honors which Indian soldiers won on the battlefield. Mr. Borkar has mentioned about 2.5 million people, and 87 people died, or 64,000 people, 87,000 people died, and 64 Jawans were wounded, or men were wounded. So I fully agree with the question that has been raised by Mr. Philip Matthew, editor of the week, when he says, despite contributing the largest all-volunteer army in the history of human conflict, India has largely forgotten its role in World War II. It's not only India, but I can also blame the British for that, are not giving the right kind of emphasis. Is it because we see it more as a British effort ourselves rather than Indian? But how can we ever forget when Indian lives were lost and Indian heroes won honor on the battlefield, unquote. That is what Philip Matthew said. When the war started, Indian army was only about 200,000 people, but which included, of course, the British officers who were there with us. And when it ended, we had 2.5 million people, and the casualties I have mentioned to you. Let's not forget the awards that were won for valor and for the bravery. 6,300 awards they were won. 31 Victoria Cross, the highest gallantry award given to individuals. 31 Victoria Cross, 4 George Crosses, which is the next in order of gallantry, 252 Distinguished Service Orders, and 347 Indian Order of Merit, and 1,311 military crosses. And I must mention to you that for quite some time, these awardees did not get allowances for their bravery after we became independent. It took quite some time for us to persuade the government that they also deserve some awards, monetary awards every month for the bravery that they had shown. It was the largest voluntary army, and even Winston Churchill, not very liked by people in India for whatever he used to say about that, even he said that, yes, it was the largest voluntary army ever raised in the history of the world. So why do the British, many political leaders in India, undermine this contribution of Indian soldiers? And we have not appreciated the valor, bravery, and sacrifice. And this is why I think this book is absolutely essential. It's good that it has come, and I'm glad that it has come out now when we are celebrating 75th anniversary of our gaining independence. Now, talking about whether the Indians gave okay to this war or not, we all know that except for Subhash Chandra Bose, nobody objected to our contribution in that. I'm talking of both Muslim League, and when Viceroy Linlithgow, he announced the entry of India in the war. Muslim League, I think they had okayed it right from the beginning. They supported it, but the congressmen, they didn't say much. They did say that we want independence, but they looked the other way when all the volunteers were taken abroad. and when they fought for that. And the Congress, let me also quote Pandit Nehru, who at one stage said, "This is not the time to bargain with Britain. We are against the rising imperialism of Germany, Italy, and Japan, and for decaying imperialism of Europe." Unquote. This is what Pandit Nehru said himself. So let me emphasize that the Indian participation in the war, they participated not only because the British wanted it, but also because the Indian leaders themselves had okayed it. They also did not say anything wrong. So they deserve as much credit as far as Indian soldiers are concerned for winning this war as the British and their allies. That is what I feel about it. Just let me mention a few quotes from the officers, the bonding that we had with our senior officers of that time. Sir Claude Auchinleck, he said the British could not have come through both the wars. He's talking about World War I as well as World War II, if they hadn't had the Indian Army. So that is the kind of Field Marshal Slim, who commanded 14th Army. He wrote in his book, The Defeat into Victory. He said, "My Indian divisions after 1943 were among the best in the world. They go anywhere, do anything, go on doing it, and do it for very little." Unquote. And even Winston Churchill, he said at one stage, "The whole empire has been stirred by the achievement of Indian forces in Eritrea." That was among the first few wars, first few battles that we fought when the war started, Second World War. So younger generation, I feel very strongly, needs to be reminded of India's contribution in saving the world from Hitler, Mussolini, and Imperial Japan. And this book is a much needed contribution to India's military history, a chapter that I believe is full of pride, full of valor, and sacrifices made for the world peace. And let me add at the end that even today, the Indian armed forces, they continue with the tradition which they had from World War I, World War II, and we do carry the battle honors. All the regiments carry their battle honors with great pride and great inspiration. And we believe that this is the legacy which has helped the Indian armed forces to carry forward their great traditions, not only before independence, but post-independence also in all the wars that we have fought, whether it was 47, 48, and thereafter. And the tradition of fidelity, of honor, of bravery, and of course, the pursuit of excellence. Thank you very much, Mr. Borkar. I think I must mention this is the contribution that we had, and it should never be forgotten.
Thank you very much, General Malik, for that intervention. Now, before I ask Dr. Robert Lyman to speak, and Dr. Lyman is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and also has been a officer of the British Army. Now, and he's done a PhD on Field Marshal Bill Slim, who had a great role during the World War. But I would like to, raise this point which General Malik has raised, that the British till today do not acknowledge the role of the Indian Army to the extent they should. After all, we fought the battles, we won honors, we showed valor. We did so many things, but whatever. But we, as he mentioned that when you had the commemoration, the Indians were not given their due place in that scenario. But whatever. But I would like you to answer that question of which General Malik has raised. Over to Dr. Robert Lyman.
Mr. Borkar and distinguished panelists and General Malik, it's a great pleasure to be with you today and to be talking about this fantastically important subject. It's been a subject close to my heart for many years. And in the next few months, my new book on the war in the Far East will be published in the UK and India, A War of Empires, in which I attempt to answer some of the questions that General Malik and Mr. Borkar have raised today. Why is it that the Indian contribution to victory in the Second World War has been largely forgotten? And I'm going to address that today in a short explanation when I look at why India has forgotten its past. And I want to say, we can raise this in questions as well, but I want to start by saying the elephant in the room in this conversation is that what happened before independence in 1947 wasn't India's history. Indeed, the assumption by many over the decades since independence is that what happened before 1947, including the Second World War, happened to another far distant country. This is because, so it's argued, pre-1947 India was undivided, and for Indian nationalists, tainted by an Islam that has exported itself to Pakistan and to Bangladesh, and second, that it was part of the British Raj and thus tainted by Britain. It's politically unbecoming, or at least it has been politically unbecoming, to equate a sense of Indianhood with what Marxist historians in the West and Indian nationalists in India tell us was India's slave status under colonialism. Now, as a Briton researching India's role in the Second World War, I've encountered this view repeatedly over the years, but it is hardly logical. In fact, it gives us particular problems when we look at the Second World War and India's contribution to the vast human experience that reset the structure of the modern world. The problem is that what I call post-colonial interpretation makes slaves of Indians. It argues that they had no personal control of their destiny because the government was in the hands of others. When the British declared war, India became an unwilling participant. This argument, simply stated, is that the top-down forces of colonial government, together with all the systems, structures, cultures, and attitudes in India, were deeply and inherently exploitative, such that it cannot properly be argued that colonial intentions were anything other than unfair and abusive. In this view, Indian men and a few women fought and strived against their will, even though they weren't fully aware of it, as cultural coercion blinded them to the reality that they were fighting a British war against Britain's enemies. Now, the absurdity of this argument suggests, to give but one example, that General Auchinleck's otherwise culture-challenging efforts in 1943 and 1944 to raise the pay of Indian commissioned officers to the levels of their British colleagues was for the purpose of buying their loyalty rather than giving them equality with their peers. Equally, it seriously suggested in some quarters that the offer of money likewise persuaded millions of otherwise impoverished Indians to sign up for war work during the industrial expansion of India. Illiterate peasants knew no better than to take the financial bribes offered in exchange for their labor. It's argued that others were forced by convention and the belief that family and personal honor depended on a military career. Millions of men thus became mercenaries of the British, subject to intense and relentless propaganda which bound their minds and wills in an unprecedented and highly successful coercive manipulation. Well, I suggest that we recognize these assertions to be exaggerations and political point scoring to prove that the Raj was bad and that the Indians who willingly stood up against fascism in Europe and totalitarianism in Asia during the Second World War weren't doing it for India, but because they were forced against their conscious will to do so. But I can find no evidence that 2.5 million men joined the Indian Army between 1939 and 1945 as the result of a propaganda offensive by the British government, which, and I quote, secured the partial allegiance or at least acquiescence of the population. The argument suggests that the reason, or at least part of it, for the recruitment of such large numbers to the Indian Army lay in subconscious coercion. Yet this does not explain why the men thus recruited to the Indian army, as General Malik has explained, were prepared to die for this compulsion, and why Indian soldiers were to win 22 of the 34 Victoria and George Crosses awarded, for example, during the Burma campaign. It's rational to conclude that, instead, most Indians who joined the armed forces in such extraordinary numbers, yes, the largest volunteer army in the world in the whole of history, did so because they had weighed up the options and assessed the nature of the sacrifice they were willing to make for the sake of the government of India, regardless of its political colour. In this sense, their decision was made on the basis of a conception of India much larger than the framework of politics as it existed at the time within Indian polity. The threat to their conception of what India was and what India could be therefore far outweighed the rights and wrongs in their minds of colonialism, if the issue or argument ever surfaced at all for the majority of young men making the choice to join up. The truth is, in my view, that reality trumped ideology in the face of the imminent and existential danger to the Indian state in 1941 and 42 by the Japanese. Most Indians accepted that the Raj was, rightly or wrongly, or for the time being, the legally constituted government of India. Like all governments everywhere, it had supporters and opponents. Few who opposed the government on nationalistic or self-governance grounds questioned its legitimacy, as that would have invalidated their own claim to be its successor in due course. Likewise, the Indian army was India's army, not Britain's. As Professor Roger Beaumont observes, it is most interesting to weigh the charges that the Raj built its army in India as an oppressive instrument against what one sees in how lovingly and energetically the Indians have retained the model. The evidence suggests instead that the theory of prosaic oppression and its common language of unconscious bias and systemic structures of power, all the terminology you'd expect from the Marxist perspective of history, is a fabricated political construct that does not relate to what we know through the historical record of everyday human experience of colonial India, especially in wartime, the facts being squeezed to fit within a fixed and unbending theoretical model. So it's true that India did not have political independence, but in every other sense, the freedom to make social, economic, and political choices within this overall environment cannot be said to have been constrained by such oppression that human agency, the decision or other of people to make choices in their lives, was so deviously manipulated to suit ruling British interests. Young Indian men and young British men both joined their respective armies for the same purpose in times of peace, for adventure, for employment, for the lure of military glory, the age-old attraction of the sword. Indians were no more victims of their polity than were Britons, both of whom, of course, were victims of the fascist and totalitarian militarism that dragged the world into a second great slaughter that century of World War. The tyranny to which some refer, if it relates to anything, can only do so to the prosaic constraints of ordinary civic society, such as obeying the law. I'm talking about the Quit India campaign in 1942, for instance, as can be seen during those protests, rather than that of an unbending and devious oppression in which India had to do Britain's will. Looking back at the imperial period through the lens of victimhood is therefore deeply problematic, historically and philosophically. It ensures that we never see the 350 million Indians at the time as they saw themselves, collectively or individually, a people, in fact, with acute political agency, as is evidenced by the burgeoning nationalist movement that General Malik has mentioned, and on a journey to self-rule. Likewise, it treats every Briton in India at the time, every level of power exercised, and every action undertaken in response to a decision by London or Delhi to be oppressive. And it conversely fails to treat Indians fairly as individuals denying to them the fact that they wielded real power. In imperial power relationships, agency, the ability of one side to make decisions or choices, is never one-sided. The victimhood mantle ignores the reality that the actual power wielded by Indian political, social, and economic agency in the 1920s and 1930s, combined, of course, with Japan's pricking of the imperial bubble and the capture of Malaya and Singapore and Burma in 1942, enabled India, as General Malik has said, to achieve independence in 1947. So our sense today, looking back, of the size of the nationalist protest against colonial rule has almost certainly exaggerated its impact on ordinary people. This is not to underestimate its ultimate importance. Rather, the noise it made at the time in terms of the influence it had on the behavior of men considering joining the armed forces and the impact it had on those who had already enlisted. And General Malik has already made the point that Indian leaders at the time, both Muslim and Hindu, were content to allow the recruitment of soldiers to the Indian army because they recognized that there was an existential threat to the integrity of the Indian state, a state which in due course they wished to inherit. History always, of course, remembers the noisy minority whose views tend to be overrepresented in any analysis of the past, while generally neglecting those without a voice. And this is one of the great sadnesses I have, that very few Indian soldiers, very few of those 2.5 million men and a small number of women who joined up to fight Hitler and Hirohito, left any written record for us to evaluate as historians. Fortunately, nationalism and respect for the government's legitimate role in defending India, and even a colonial one, were not mutually exclusive in 1942, or the ranks of the armed forces might have remained empty and India's door opened at Imphal and Kohima for the Japanese to march in. Perhaps it is precisely because the ranks of the army were so large between 1942 and 45 that much effort is generated today in post-colonial studies in explaining away why these men joined in such numbers and with such alacrity. India, modern India, therefore, has every right to recover the history of the pre-1947 period, for it was then that the foundations of modern India were established. My book, which is being published soon, describes how the Indian Army in 1944 and 1945 was world-beating. The Japanese in Assam and Manipur in 1944 and in Burma in 1945 were defeated by Slim's 14th Army, an army that was 87% Indian. Victory in Asia could never have taken place without Indians coming forward in large numbers and of their own volition to serve their country and to sacrifice their lives where it was necessary. And it's this which India, and yes, Pakistan and Bangladesh as well, can legitimately take great pride. Thank you very much indeed. I look forward to answering questions later.
Thank you, Dr. Lyman. We'll come to the questions a little later. Now I'll request Squadron Leader Rana to come in. He's been a helicopter pilot with the Indian Air Force and is presently heading the Center for Military History and Conflict Research, the United Services Institution of India, as a secretary and editor. Squadron Leader Chin.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And at the outset, I'd like to thank the IIC and Mr. Prasannan for the invitation and for giving me the honor of being part of such a distinguished panel. Before I proceed, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, fine. I just thought I'd check.
We can hear you very well. Go ahead.
Dr. Lyman makes some interesting points regarding India's attitude to recalling its role in the Second World War. And before I go on to commenting about the book, I'd like to say that I think that this lack of a culture of commemoration extends beyond conflicts falling within the colonial period into the post-independence era as well. It's our societal approach to remembrance is fraught with inconsistency. It's a result of official apathy, and in the early decades after independence, at least, I think there was an aversion to what may have been seen as the dangers of glorifying militarism. The United Service Institution where I work has in recent years been actively working to rectify this by attempting to push for a grassroots culture of remembrance in the country so that the sacrifice of those of our soldiers, sailors, and airmen who gave their life for their country in various wars throughout history should not be forgotten. Yet at the heart of this initiative, I'd also like to say that there lies an anti-war message. We don't seek to glorify conflict, but to learn from the futility of it. As Mr. Prasannan has pointed out, and actually all the previous speakers, even, the story of India's involvement in the Second World War is a fascinating one, whether it's Force K6 at Dunkirk, whether it's the aid to Russia convoys that carried supplies, much needed supplies to the beleaguered Russians across the mountains, or whether, of course, it was halting the Japanese invasion and delivering the biggest defeat in Japanese military history at the very doorsteps of India. All of this was quintessentially an Indian effort. And indeed, I think it highlights the requirement for books such as the one by Mr. Prasannan, because this effort, these stories have been largely forgotten for a variety of reasons. Yet these, Mr. Prasannan's book and others like it, they help to eradicate the high levels of ignorance about India's sterling and pivotal role in that global conflict. And this was a role that I think we do well to remember, that set our nation firmly on the path to a hastened independence, and which, when we reclaim it today after 76 long years, it helps strengthen our claim to being a major player on the global stage. And I'll refer to that a little later. I would like to say that war is usually a harbinger of social and political change, and its effects are out of all proportions to the tactical events that shape it. It's like the ripples in a pond, the events that are set in motion through the medium of human conflict, they reverberate through the decades, sometimes longer. And I'll give you just one small example. The modern Middle East, as we know it today, was carved out of the corpse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War. And in campaigns that were once again largely fought by Indian forces. In many ways, the world is still coping with the consequences of those actions and fighting battles because of the events that were set into motion nearly a century ago. I'd say that in post-colonial India, the state has always had an uneasy relationship with war, and the roots of this unease can be traced back to our colonial past, perhaps. I think it's been very rightly said that war is a continuation of politics by other means. And nowhere is this Clausewitzian maxim better amplified than in the relationship between war and the politics of the Indian freedom struggle. And I would take you back to a previous conflict. So the Indian political response to the First World War was very different to that which it exhibited upon the outbreak of the Second. In 1914, Indian aspirations were limited to attaining the status of a self-governing dominion within a larger framework of the British Empire. And as such, all hues of political opinion were united in their support of Indian involvement in the war effort. However, it was the failure of the colonial authorities to adequately satisfy these aspirations after the end of that war that led to a hardening of political postures and culminating in the demand for complete independence. Now, the outbreak of the Second World War actually then sees a complete reversal of political opinion from 1914, again, for a variety of reasons. But if we just simplify that, Indian political parties refused to support the war effort, with perhaps the exception of the Muslim League, as General Malik pointed out. on the grounds that this was an imperial war in which India was not involved, and more importantly, in which it was not consulted. So Indian participation in the war was used as a major bargaining chip by Indian politicians, who were incidentally, as again has been pointed out by my previous speakers, they weren't morally averse to taking part in the conflict, provided the British were ready to meet their demands at the end of it. As a matter of fact, between support for Britain's enemies and support for the Allies, the latter, which is the support for the Allies, was considered the more acceptable alternative because everybody recognized the dangers of fascism and tyranny that the victory of the Axis powers represented. So it was in the midst of this immense political churning that India actually raises this army of 2.5 million men, as has been pointed out, forming the largest volunteer army ever raised in the history of human conflict. And there are many fascinating facets of our participation in that war, which remain largely unknown. For instance, it's not often known that the Indian Army participated as had sent Force K6 to Dunkirk, where those 4 animal transport companies conducted themselves with, well, exemplarily. Indian divisions also won lasting renown in the campaigns in North Africa, in the Western Desert, Eritrea, Ethiopia, the Middle East, Italy, Greece, Burma, and the Far East. Now, while Indian divisions were becoming household names in many parts of the world, Indian soldiers were also involved in another venture that had an enormous political impact in India and on the freedom movement. Now, and I think it would be remiss of me to talk about World War II without mentioning the threat posed to the colonial state by the raising of the INA and to a lesser extent the German Legion, and the impact it had on the colonial psyche, which far exceeded anything thrown up by direct political agitation on the home front. It was the INA trials and the post-war Royal Indian Navy mutiny and the RAF strikes. These were all forceful indicators that the writing was on the wall and that time was ripe for the colonial authorities to begin their retreat from empire. Now, apart from its impact on the Indian freedom struggle in purely military terms, the war contributed immensely to hastening the process of Indianization of the officer corps, the rapid expansion of the IAF, the Royal Indian Navy, and the overall establishment of technical arms in the Indian military, as well as laying the foundations of defense production in the country. And I do think that India played a key military and economic role in the strategy, both of the Axis and the Allied powers during the Second World War. And if I would quote Philip Mason, it served as, I quote, as a long-range goal of Japanese operations in Southeast and East Asia and of German advances in the Soviet Union and in Northern Africa, as a base of defense and supply of the Anglo-American forces east of Suez, as a springboard for their counteroffensives in Southeast Asia, and as a base for an airlift to China, unquote. Now, for many years, this role has been negated, if not positively disowned by certain sections of both the Indian political establishment, as well as our intelligentsia, ostensibly because this was not our war. Now, while this assertion may have had a certain resonance in the years immediately following independence, I don't think it's valid any longer. When we progress far down the road, we've come out of the colonial shadow, not just in time and space, but also in our national objectives. And I feel that as a resurgent India seeks to be a major player on the world stage, it honestly behoves us to discard this very narrow post-colonial worldview and to step up to reclaim the role that our armed forces played out on a global scale not all that long ago. And I would also like to say that the same troops that stood shoulder to shoulder with the Allies and proved that they were second to none by defeating some of the best military machines of the time, that's the German and the Japanese army, these were the same troops that were instrumental in saving the Whale of Kashmir for India in 1947-48. So those of those people who tend to dismiss that army as an army of mercenaries, must also remember that armies don't drop out of the sky. They are the result of long years of training, indoctrination, and so on and so forth. So the story of the Indian Army or rather the story of the Second World War, I would say, is as much an Indian story as a global one, and that's a fact that is well worth remembering. Mr. Prasannan's book does precisely that. It encapsulates the Indian role in the war from a purely Indian perspective. It's simple, in a very simple manner. It's easy to read format is, I think commends it to a younger readership in particular. And I would say that India is today a great supporter of the multilateral world order. This is an order that our soldiers helped to create with their blood and their sacrifice. And it's not for nothing that India was invited to be one of the founding members of the United Nations in 1945. We arrived on the international arena heralded by the legacy of active participation in the two world wars, plain and simple. Because of our role in the fight against tyranny and fascism. I would therefore heartily recommend that we lay claim to this forgotten legacy in our own larger national interest. And we do well to remember that those who do not record their history stand the danger of being written out of history altogether. As has been pointed out, over 87,000 of our countrymen fell in the fight against fascism. They were instrumental in restoring world peace and in establishing a new world order. We owe it as much to their memory, as well to our future generations, to honor the monumental achievements of this forgotten army in order to reinforce our claim to being one of the pillars in the edifice of the emerging world order today. That's all I have to say, and be happy to answer any questions at the end of the session.
Thank you, Squadron Leader Chinna. Now, I'll take advantage of being the moderator and pose a few questions. But before that, I want to flag what Prasanna has mentioned. And there's a link to the India International Center in your book. This is section 3, chapter 2, and you are mentioning Jeremy Raceman of the Indian Civil Service, and you talk about the Jew who saved India and Pakistan. And in that, you mention our founder, C.D. Deshmukh, who was part of the Indian delegation to the Bretton Woods Conference in 1945. So I just said that there's a connection with IIC there. Thank you. Now, Squadron Leader Chinna mentioned about the role of the INA. I would like the panel to answer this question that, you see, we as a country decided after our independence that we wouldn't reinduct the officers and men of the INA into the Indian Army. Now, you see, if I, correct me if I'm wrong, but you had Habibur Rahman, Netaji's chief of staff in Singapore. He was reinducted in the Pakistan Army. There have been many officers and men reinducted. So why did we do that? And would General Malik answer that? And then to Squadron Leader Chinna and of course Dr. Lyman. Because there seems to have been tremendous British pressure on the nascent Indian political body at that time. Okay. General Malik?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Borkar. There is no doubt that a very large number of Indians felt that the Indian National Army had also contributed to our freedom struggle, and they continue to do so. There is no doubt about it. Now, while the British decided to, I would say British India decided to take disciplinary action, and they started court-martialing the number of people who had deserted from the British Indian Army And those trials, as you know, were going on in the Red Fort area. They were defended by Pandit Nehru and Bhulabhai Desai. During that period, I believe that there was some survey taken in the army units, Indian army units. And most of the people felt that they ought to be punished, but lightly, because of the role that they have, because of the good work that they had done as far as the freedom struggle is concerned. So, but the other aspect of the discipline of the oath, that the fact is that they had disowned the oath that was given to a soldier. And an oath matters a lot to a soldier, let me tell you one thing. And so that was one survey which was done by the Indian Army at that time. And secondly, of course, was the Mountbatten advice to Pandit Nehru, and Pandit Nehru did consult General Cariappa and a few others, and they all felt that the whole situation of the INA had been so politicized at that time. The whole of country had got involved in the trials of the Indian National Army personnel, that by inducting some of these people into the Indian Army, there was a danger of the Indian Army getting politicized. Now, that is an important aspect because, as you know, the army before the independence and army after the independence has always remained apolitical. We continue to do so. So there was this danger which was felt by the Indian leaders post-independence. And when they saw this survey and when they consulted the people, they felt that it is better to keep them out. While it was good to defend them during the court-martials that were taking place, but we should not take them in the Indian Army. But as you know, some of these people like Shah Nawaz and Mohan Singh, they joined the political. One person became Minister of State in the Railways, the other became a member of the Rajya Sabha. Coming to Pakistan, yes, it was not only Habibur Rahman, but also Zaman Kiani, who also had been part of the INA. He was also taken. But these people, many of them, they participated along with the irregulars of the Pakistan Army, which came to J&K in 1947-48. And later on, even the Pakistanis felt themselves that their sense of discipline and their politicization was so much that they did not want to take them into the Pakistan Army. So there are a very few incidents of these people who joined the irregular forces of Pakistan in 47-48. But I don't see many numbers really in the Pakistan regular army post-independence.
Thank you, General.
So that is what I feel.
Thank you very much. Can I ask the same question to Squadron Leader Chinna, please?
Yes, I would second what General Malik has said. The primary reason for not inducting, or rather not allowing the ex-INA personnel back into the Indian Army was pure and simple that we did not want a politicized army. You did not want, even till today, if you are a member of a political, a serving soldier cannot be a member of any political organization. So that was, the intent was to keep the army and the armed forces apolitical. In Pakistan, where they did induct these, some of these men in varying degrees, the results are there for us to see. And however, I would also like to correct one thing which you had mentioned, Mr. Borkar. The fact of the matter is, the decision not to take the INA men back into the armed forces was not a British one. This was taken by Indian officers. After 1946, most of the decisions were now being taken in. It was very difficult for the British that were still over here to kind of implement their agendas if they had any. But this was a pure and simple. It was an Indian decision, and in my view, it was the correct decision that you do not allow politicized soldiers into the military.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Robert Lyman, would you like to chip in on this? And also, coming back to what General Malik had said in his presentation, that you see, the British still, to some extent, do not recognize the Indian Army's contribution to the Second World War. I mean, would you answer that? Because your presentation.
Yes, I will.
There are two questions, one on the INA and one this, and then we'll wind up because time is running out. Thank you very much.
Well, two quick points. I agree with General Malik and Rana China on the INA. I think the reality about the INA, well, if you look at the integration reports from 1947-48, the assessment of whether an individual should go back into the Indian Army, or in fact, even in 1946, the Red Fort trials, was based on an individual one. So individuals were assessed very, very carefully to see how politicized those individuals had become. Because we do need to remember that in 1942, the collapse of the British in Malaya and Singapore really was quite a profound one. And Japanese propaganda was very, very strong. And it's very easy to understand why many Indian soldiers made a decision to join what was the Indian National Army at that time. It changed its name later on. Decided to make a positive decision in favor of the INA rather than the prisoner of war camp. The Japanese were brutal and executed a number of particularly Sikh soldiers in Singapore in 1942 who refused to join the INA. So there was a degree of coercion there. But if you look at the Red Fort records, very, very careful assessment was made of the individual's politicization. So what extent did the individual themselves become immersed in the nationalist rhetoric of Subhas Chandra Bose in particular? That was the primary concern. And Rana and General Malik are both absolutely right. The decision was made by the Indian Army. There were a number of notorious incidents where Indian officers in the 14th Army in 1944 and 45 had to instruct their soldiers not to shoot members of the INA who surrendered, because the Indian Army by that stage were thoroughly embarrassed by their fellows who had given in to the Japanese. But as a historian, we can look at these issues objectively and recognize why they happened. To your other point, a very important point, why is it, I think we understand why is it that India has forgotten its contribution to the dramatic success of the Allies in defeating totalitarianism in the Second World War. It's a much more important question, or equally important question, to ask why Britain has, and it is true.
No, it's not. India has forgotten more. What the British are not recognizing our contribution.
Yes. So the fact of the matter is, Britain has also forgotten India's dramatic contribution to success in the Second World War, and there are a number of reasons for it. In the first, the British always regarded their contribution to the defeat of the Japanese as being peripheral, being secondary to the defeat of the Germans. It was part of the Germany First policy. India was a long way away. A very small number of troops, relatively speaking, British troops, were involved in the 14th Army fighting the Japanese. So it was a much smaller effort militarily, and therefore has received much less importance and much less consideration in the United Kingdom. You know that members of the 14th Army considered themselves to be the forgotten army during the Second World War, in major part because they weren't getting mentioned in the news, and they weren't getting the exposure that their colleagues in Italy and in Europe, Northwest Europe, were getting. So and then at the end of the Second World War, and subsequently, remembrance and focus in Britain has tended to focus on Europe. I very much regret that. I mean, one of the things that I've been doing for the last 30 years in my research and publications is to emphasize the importance to a British audience of the Indian Army, and make the point that this was not a coercive or a mercenary army. It was an army of Indians, as I said earlier, who were doing their bit to defend the free world. And this is the whole point of Prasannan's excellent book, and I'm delighted that it's come out. It's one of the first books I've seen in India on the subject of placing India's involvement back in the forefront of its history. And I would say that Prasannan's book needs to be sold in the UK. So you need to get the publisher selling it widely over here in order to be able to do precisely the same thing here that you're doing in India, which is remind a British audience that the Second World War wasn't won by Britain standing alone, but by the remarkable contribution of the wider Commonwealth.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So this is complimenting Prasanna for recalling the saga of the Indian role in the Second World War and then winning the battle. Now there's a title amendment, against the Japs also and Hitler, as General Malik suggested.
Yes,
But
sure.
thank you very much. It's been very enriching discussion, and thanks to the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Lyman. Thank you.
Here's the book.
And congratulations, Prasannan and Rana China, and the week, of course.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all. So look forward to there is more.
I'm still waiting for my hardcover book at the moment.
Oh, yes, of course.
Waiting
It's
for
already
that.
on the way, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, and
Thank
all
you,
the
sir.
best. And thank you very much, all my colleagues on the panel. Thank you. And thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you, sir.
Borkar.
Thank you, Dr. Lyman. Thank you, China, sir. Thank you,
Thank you,
both.
sir.
How are you? Thank you. And Ms. Munshi, thanks.
Thank you very much.